Hello everyone, this is John from RPGs and More, and today I want to talk a little bit about a rule that I found while going through White Box Gothic, which is a supplement for the Swords and Wizardry White Box rules. Those rules written by Matthew Finch, and the White Box Gothic is written by James Spahn. Now, the rule we're going to talk about is the dread and the corruption rules. And to get to those, we're going to go to page 18. Okay, chapter 2, Staring into the Abyss, starting at page 18. I'm going to start with corruption. Now, one of the reasons why I want to talk about this is because this is an interesting rule for anyone who's running a white box campaign who wants to make the dichotomy of good versus evil into something that's tangible, something that really actually makes a bit of sense, excuse me, instead of being something that is arbitrary. If you like the idea of good being representative of what is good and right, and evil being representative of what is wrong, but you don't like the idea of, so-and-so race or heritage is inherently evil or inherently good, then this is something that you might want to take a second look at, because what corruption is a means of measuring the actions and experiences of a player character or of an NPC as they go along the path in life between being a good person and not. Now, corruption itself is a score that you can add to your character sheet. And it's just going to be one number. And it's just something to keep track of. It doesn't have any big overarching effects on your character per se, but it's going to be something that is going to give you some advice on how your character is perceived by others. But what gives your character corruption? Well, that's pretty well laid out here. We start with witnessing an act of extreme sadism or torture, witnessing the death of a close friend or loved one, encountering a powerful undead creature for the first time. Those are the three beginning moments that can begin your character's journey down the road of corruption. And these are, in essence, they can be passive events. It's something that your character just might stumble onto as they go through life. In fact, most likely you're going to stumble onto these at one point in time, especially if you're the average D&D party who maybe one of the characters likes to indulge in torturing the monsters that you capture for information because they think that's fun and cool. Well, this is a way to dissuade that behavior in an in-world way, because what these rules assume is that evil acts like torturing torture and sadism have a tangible effect upon the person that commit them, as well as those who witness them. It changes you. And as you, for example, actually committing an act of extreme sadism or torture will give you 3 corruption points if you fail the save against it. And you get a -3 to the save against corruption, because that's how corruption works. Whenever you commit an act or experience an act which may lead to corruption, you roll a saving throw. And depending on the act that you committed yourself or what you witnessed, there might be a modifier, usually negative, to that saving throw. And if you fail, then you receive a corruption point, or 2 corruption points, or 3 corruption points. It goes up to 8 corruption points for committing large-scale murder or genocide. And what these things do is, well, your character is going to accumulate these over time, perhaps, if they continue to go down these dark roads. After gaining 5 corruption points in one of these methods, the character starts to be noticed by those around them as the universe kind of sends subtle hints about their corruption. Maybe animals, wild animals, or domesticated animals become very uneasy around that person. You know, that dog that used to, lick everyone's hands when you went to, meet them, when you were passing by the stable or something. Now that dog starts, barking and growling at that particular character. Or, horses stomp and neigh or whinny whenever that character's around, trying to express their displeasure at close proximity to this person. Or those who are, particularly wholesome in their life will feel that sense of unease. Just not much, but just enough to be like, that person seems unsavory. And that's after 5. So if you accumulate up to 10, that's when the darkness begins to really take hold on that person. That because you usually can't get to 10 corruption points without choosing to commit those acts. At that point, it is a choice. 0 to 5 and above 5, some of that can happen by accident. Some of that can happen by just, witnessing life. But doubtful, but possible. But once you get to 10, that's definitely a choice. And these effects will reflect that. So the character's eyes might radiate a red light in darkness, or every once in a while they will speak in the gibbering whispers of an unknown tongue that no one can decipher, and it seems to come at random. Or perhaps they have an aversion to holy symbols or blooming roses. And that is something that's really kind of neat because these are just suggestions. How you want this to manifest is something that you as a DM and your player can work out. It has to be something real, something tangible, something that people will notice. But it doesn't necessarily have to be debilitating. And it says this. This is not you're not getting a negative modifier to things. You're not getting any mechanical losses here. This is storytelling right now. Okay, and there might be some unease in the role-playing aspect of things, and maybe the DM might rule that they get a soft penalty of -1 to charisma checks with those people who are truly goodly in nature. But maybe not, because people who are truly goodly in nature will do their best to see past the minor corruptions of life and try to help people anyway, right? Okay. And then the truly bad stuff comes out when you accumulate 15 or more points of corruption. Then you become an obvious madman or inhumane monster. They might appear as a great hulking beast or an evil spirit somehow incarnated into flesh. Perhaps they scream brazenly in the air, rant endlessly about the terrors they've seen, or become bestial parodies of humans who rage and froth at the mouth or are reduced to grunts and sniffs. All but the barest semblance of humanity are now gone from them. And when that kind of happens, it doesn't necessarily have to be like totally to that point where they become like a cave person, But what we're talking about is a physical transformation of some form. And it gives suggestions on how to do that. Like maybe they get a benefit of like a +1 to something, but it's also a detriment too. A -2 to something else. And what that is, you can work out with the player and the dungeon master to create something that is thematic and appropriate according to the things that provided the most corruption to the character. Excuse me. The idea is that the corruption is not meant as a punishment necessarily. It serves as a reward and punishment, but in a way this is also an acknowledgement by the forces of darkness within the universe that this game is taking place in, that this character is one of their own. And so they will embrace that person, and that embracing of them turns them into something that the average person is going to have a hard time interacting with. And that's where you can get like some really twisted, like an individual with so their hands become long and thin like legs of a spider, or and it just becomes very unsettling. Or maybe they grow some kind of mutation that is just gross, or maybe that person simply just gains an unsettling visage because they become deathly pale for no apparent reason, and their eyes are a little sunken, even though they're otherwise the perfect picture of health. Things can vary. It depends on what you work out. Now, why use corruption? Well, because if you want to take away the idea that some monsters are inherently evil, that's fine. In fact, I really promote that. I think that we should take away that idea. I think that evil monsters exist and should exist, but evil as an individual or as a small group, not evil as a whole. So not all goblins are going to be evil little conniving tricksters necessarily, unless you decide as a GM that in your world that is true. And that's fine, because that's your world and you can make that choice. I'm just saying that in general speaking, as we look at goblins in the monster manual, we shouldn't necessarily always assume that they're always going to be evil. We kind of talked about in the Cipher System video I did last night, so I'm not going to go over that, retread that again. But the idea being that since not all creatures of a certain type are going to be evil, then you can use this corruption instead to help you identify and help your players identify those things that are evil. Because really this is more, in my view, this becomes more of a tool for the DM to create villains than necessarily for the players to like punish bad behavior. You can use it to kind of like encourage good behavior, because hey, if you torture that prisoner, you're going to have to make a corruption saving throw. So let's find ways to get that information that don't involve torture and being bad to people. There's got to be more ways than one to skin a cat. Hopefully you're not skinning cats, but you catch my drift. Or maybe you are. Maybe you want to run an evil campaign and like you want that to be the focus, and this is your guideline for you and your players on what we should be doing to commit these evil acts to gain this corruption and become the evil dark lords. I mean, if that's your jam, go for it. It's still D&D. It's still role-playing, and that's fine with me as long as no one gets hurt and everyone's having fun at the table. You play how you want. But I like it because it takes the arbitrariness of good and evil away, and it gives you an actual guidance, an actual form of, this is how good is defined in this game. This is how corruption and evil is defined in this game. And it gives you tangible things you can say, like, instead of just, oh, well, you just have to be good, you can say, well, these are the things you do to become evil. And then by looking at that, you can also say, well, and these are the things that people who are good will do in order to be good. What I would argue is, unless you're actually running a Gothic campaign and you're going like full Count Vlad Dracula, you really want to really accentuate the classic horrorness of the Gothic genre. Unless you really want to do that, you can do a standard fantasy game with these rules, and it's okay. You just also, I would encourage to have some sort of rules or guidelines for how can you be good? What does it mean in your world to be good? And write them down, write them out, and show them to the players, because they might want some guidance, especially someone who is playing a cleric of a good deity, they're going to want to, or a paladin, they're going to want to know, what is my code of conduct? Don't just, if your player says, I want to play a paladin, don't just sit there and say, well, okay, and let them do whatever they want to do. Give them that guidance of, this is what it means to be good. If you're having a campaign where the struggle is good versus evil, then you should, as a group, define what is good. And don't let yourself fall into the trap of like, well, it's just amorphous and everyone has their own opinions and stuff. No. That's real life. That's real life, the world that we live in. There are a lot of different opinions and stuff, and I get that, and I'm not trying to, we are not trying to make our game like real life, because we play this game in order to experience something different than real life. So this is your chance to define for your campaign world with your players what is good and what is evil, and then make that chart, because this rule set starts out with a chart of actions that lead to corruption, but you can add to them. You can add more. Like those are just guidelines to get you started. The second rule we're going to talk about today is dread. Dread is a much smaller rule, but it ties into that. So someone who is corrupted, a corrupted person, may eventually begin to evoke a sense of dread. And what dread does is dread comes in levels between 1 to 5. And that corresponds to a negative modifier that other people get when they are around that person or present in that place. Because dread can also be attached to a place. Let's say a particular mausoleum was the site, not only of the death of a beloved person, but it was actually the site of their murder, their heinous murder at the hands of someone who they thought was their lover, and it turned out to be someone just trying to get close to them, who killed them in a particularly horrifying manner. And ever since then, that place has just felt wrong to everyone around them. That's a place of dread, and maybe it's only a level 1 or a level 2 place of dread. And what that means is that anyone who's trying to do something in that location gets a -1 or a -2 to that action, whether it's an attack roll or a saving throw, or a skill check of some kind, or an ability check when they're trying to do something, especially if they're trying to face off whatever revenant has risen up in this location of dread in order to further the curse that is placed upon it. Or it's a person, it's a creature that walks and roams the land because that creature was personally betrayed, or committed great acts themselves, and now they can never rest. And again, whenever you're in a close proximity to this person, let's say I think it's about 30 feet, then you can have between a -1 to a -5 anytime someone tries to attack them or cast a spell that might affect them. Anything that involves dice would have a -1 to -5 modifier against that creature. And this is something that you can apply to anything. There can be a dreaded goblin if you want. If you want to have like a particular, a goblin pirate who has just wreaked havoc and become a complete monster of a creature over time. Maybe they're a highly corrupted individual, or maybe they're just someone that exudes dread. They're a blackguard. And they have that feeling of dread around them. So anyone who is not one of their allies that is around them just feels this aura of evilness. And it takes a certain amount of goodness in order to combat that. And so then you need that paladin or that cleric of a good deity to be able to even get close to this person, or to be able to get past some of those modifiers. Or maybe that's the whole point, is that even these modifiers affect even the holy people, but the holy people are the ones who are charged to take this threat down in order to remove the corruption from the land. Because once a person who it has dread on them is killed, the dread goes away. Once an area has been cleansed and had a spell cast upon it to remove the curses that are placed on that area, then that dread goes away. And that really kind of helps to inform our stories, and that's a really quick way. Again, it's just levels 1 to 5, but it's a very quick and dirty way to add a little something to your area, rules-wise, in addition to your evocative descriptions, to just inspire a different feeling amongst your players and make them kind of really think about this is a bad area, or this is a bad dude. And it doesn't matter where we face this dude or this dudette. We are going to be in a bad spot regardless. And then they might start thinking tactically about how to face off against this person appropriately. What can they do to plan? So dread is a really cool mechanic from White Box Gothic that I think could be added to almost any campaign and in almost any system, really. As long as your system utilizes +1 or -1 mechanics to various roles, you can use this basic system right there without changing much of anything to kind of give a solid mechanical detriment towards people when you're facing off against things that are just freaking scary. All right. Another thing it's a sidebar in here, and it's dreaded darkness. And what that means is that in let's say the location has dread in it. Well, that means that light sources that are used in that area, whether they are flashlights with batteries, or whether they are torches that are burning, or a lantern that's burning oil, that they tend to give off less light or burn through their fuel at, almost like twice as fast, or a quarter as fast, three times as fast, whatever. That's a bit more amorphous. They don't really define that as much. And that's something that you can kind of work with on your own, is what you like. So if you're just measuring everything in 5-foot squares, then maybe the source of dread reduces that radius of the light, or its range, by 5 feet per level of dread. So if it's a level 5 location of dread, then you lose 25 feet worth of that illumination, because it's just oppressive darkness. And this affects both mundane light as well as magical light. And that's kind of a neat effect that we can add to. And again, this is built for a white box game, but you can use this in any game. Like I could use this in 5th edition right now, in a game that I'm going to be running tomorrow. And I think it would work just fine. And there's other rules for that in 5th edition too, but I like simple rules, and because they're easier to remember. But let's talk about the third thing that is in this book that I think is really neat, and that is curses. Curses is something that we talk about in fantasy literature a lot, or also in kind of our legends, the legends that we pass down from one generation of humanity to the next, from the various places that we all come from. Every people have their own legends and stories, and almost all of those legends and stories contain some form of curse, some form of someone basically pointing at someone and saying, may your milk go sour, may your children grow sick and perish, or may your crops wither and die on the vine. All any kind of just a wishing of someone to have a horrible outcome is something that happens, and we make stories about this. Now, including this into our games is kind of a really cool idea, because it assumes that evil is a presence in the world, and that evil is listening. And if you utter a curse upon someone, you don't have to be a magic user to be able to affect them. You can just be, that peasant farmer, or, the butcher's wife, or a woodcutter, or even a child who just feels this sense of injustice, whether it's real or not, whether they actually have been wronged or not. It simply requires that they feel it. They feel that they have been wronged, and they reach out with their anger, pointing at that thing that has wronged them, that person, and just curse it and throw some sort of damnation at it. And when that happens, you as the DM can make a roll. And maybe it's a saving throw. Maybe the person that had that curse directed at them makes a saving throw, or maybe the person directing the curse makes a saving throw. So when a character attempts to lay a curse on someone, they are the one who makes the saving throw to try to activate this curse. Okay? That's how that works. And I would argue that for the most part, if you're running things straight, then the NPC who attempts to lay the curse on a character would be the one to make the roll as well. But if you like player-facing stuff and you want to have the player trying to save against the curse, that's fine too. I think it works both ways, and the numbers really don't change. All that changes is who makes the roll. But this is important because a curse, when you make that saving throw roll, if it succeeds, then a minor curse or a major curse or a cataclysmic curse can be given to somebody. And the minor curse can be something that's just you can just narrate it. Like, that person is cursed to, you always have to arrange your items in alphabetical order whenever you're looking at them. Or something that's a minor, like a psychological thing that we would look at and say, in the modern day, we'd look at that and say, oh, that's a minor mental, not rightness, but not a big deal, right? We'd all look at that and say, no big deal. But in a fantasy world where they don't have knowledge of psychology, they'd be looking at this and saying, well, what's wrong with this person? Why is this a thing? And that's a minor stuff. Or maybe the minor curse is something, cosmetic. Maybe they're cursed to never wear the color purple. Or they're cursed to never, you are cursed to never wear socks. Some sort of thing that they have this tick, they just cannot do it. And if they ever try to, then the curse could manifest itself as like a rash, a really nasty red pustule rash that appears wherever that color touches their body or something like that. And it's a relatively minor thing as long as you follow it. But if you don't follow it, then it just becomes this bigger problem. And again, the curse that is uttered needs to be appropriate to the wrong that was perceived in order for the dark powers of your world. I use the term dark powers because I'm a Ravenloft fan. But in order for, whatever it is, the source of evil, for them to feel that it's appropriate, that it's good to give this curse. So for example, if you stub your toe and you say, "Oh, darn you, hammer," that they're not going to listen to that because that's just too normal. But if a person deliberately smashes your toe with a hammer and you say, "Well, may your own toes be smashed within X number of days," and you put a lot of venom into it, they might listen to that. So the other thing is that the curses can actually be combined with the corruption rules. So leveling curses is a great way to gain corruption points because you are trying to invoke the powers of darkness to bend to your will without using magic, without using the arcane or the divine in any kind of way. You have no training. You just look at that person and say, darn you. And you make that saving throw. Now here's the interesting part is you can actually, as a player, or the NPC can, accept, let's say up to 5, I think it is, additional modifiers. Oh, sorry, +1 or +2. So you can accept up to 1 or 2 corruption points by uttering a curse. And that means that whether or not the attempt to curse that person succeeds, your character has that corruption because they made the attempt to do this. They made a deliberate attempt to make the darkness do their bidding. Now, you don't do this every time your character would utter a curse, or your NPC would. So like a little kid maybe probably isn't going to be attempting to invoke the dark powers because they're probably not aware of it. This requires premeditation. For example, someone who sets up, like that peasant who hears that they could maybe, do some dangerous or dark thing upon someone else. They kind of set up that little altar to evil when they utter their curse, or they make that doll, or they do that, whatever that action is that allows them to, that helps them connect with the darker powers that you have, what you have defined as the darker powers in your world. That's what's symbolized by this modifier. But what this does, when you do that, is you gain an equivalent modifier to the saving throw to see if your curse is successful. So you accept the corruption, and then you get those points, but then you also get that modifier to the saving throw roll to make sure that it's more likely your curse will take effect. And that can be really important when you are trying to create a villain, or when your player characters have wronged someone in some way, and that person wasn't someone who was a powerful magic user, but you can use this as an engine for that person to suddenly turn from, say, a shopkeeper that was robbed into a bigger villain, because maybe they lay that curse upon the player characters, and then the player characters, in order to get rid of that curse, have to find this person and try to gain their forgiveness, or they have to try to eliminate whatever allowed this person to to utter the curse in the first place. And this creates stories. This creates the plot lines without you as the DM saying, "Oh, this is how it has to be," because the players can ignore it. They can say, "Well, we're cursed," and move on. Especially if it's a minor curse, then maybe they just won't care. But it is an emergent story. It is not something that you necessarily did to them as the DM. This is something that is a natural consequence of actions that they took. And that's another great way to kind of reinforce a sort of ethics and morality to your player characters without being too arbitrary about it. Especially because you've already talked to them about the fact that curses and corruption exist in this world, and that their characters are aware that these powers exist. That's where a lot of this lies into, or ties into, is the characters are aware. In a world where these mechanics are used, that means that everybody knows, or at least suspects, because it's part of the lore, that physical manifestations of corruption are possible. That corruption is a true and measurable thing, and that in a sense, evil is quantifiable in the world. You can look into the eyes of a madman and see their madness. These become not just colorful phrases that we can use to describe things, but actual quantifiable events in the world, where if it was in our world, we'd actually be able to have scientists measure out the level of goodness or evilness in someone's heart based upon what they're doing, or what they look like, or how these things manifest, because they're real. And that's, I think, important to remember, especially if you're running a non-Gothic style campaign, and just a standard fantasy campaign, but using these rules, because it changes how we interact with each other. When a good person or a good religion is interacting with each other, then they would all be doing these good things because they want to avoid being corrupted. They want to avoid this thing, and they want to actively seek to teach others to avoid corruption, because corruption is real and tangible and leads to the path of darkness. We can, and the way I liken it, if you wish, is kind of the Jedi in Star Wars. And we can have arguments about whether or not the Sith are the good guys and the Jedi are the bad guys and all this other stuff. I'm not going to get into that. But the idea of the Sith corruption as something that you can see. You see that manifestation of the Force in the Sith as they progress down this track towards corruption is visible and tangible. And that's what we're talking about here. So that's an example from another media that you could kind of use to help you guide along the way. Anyway, those are all rules in White Box Gothic that I think are pretty cool. They connect to a lot of stuff. Oh, there's one other aspect I forgot to mention. Spells. Certain spells can activate or can cause corruption just by casting them. Or what they do really is every time you cast that spell, you have to make a saving throw against corruption with modifiers depending on what spell it is. That's another important part of corruption because, again, it turns corruption into a choice. The player character who goes down that path of I want to be a necromancer in this world of darkness, you can say, cool. Every time you use those spells, you're making this check against this corruption, and depending on how corrupted you get, that's going to affect how you're able to interact with everyone else around you, because eventually they'll be able to see your corruption and they'll react accordingly. You may find yourself, cast away from civilization, or you may find yourself targeted by goodly characters who seek to stamp out corruption. And we can do like Wheel of Time and talk about the White Cloaks, and you can, I would argue that that's a organization that is made up of people, both good people and very corrupt people, and a good example of how an organization can become corrupt from a good purpose. There's a lot of stuff that you can draw upon in order to use these rules to turn good and evil into a choice, instead of just, oh, I'm good, oh, I'm evil. I never really liked that as far as alignment goes. I know people talk about it a lot. I don't want to go into the intricacies of alignment. I'm just saying I don't really like arbitrarily picking an alignment and then being forced to stick with it. I think that characters should be allowed to move along as they are and by their actions be judged. And this is a means of doing that. This is a means of judging someone by their actions, by measuring the corruption that they experience or that they visit upon the world through what actions they do, or through what spells they choose to cast, things like that. Again, this is all in the White Box Gothic by James Spawn. I think that these systems, the corruption, the dread, and the curses, I think they can be used in a variety of games, especially OSR games, but also, I think you could port them into 5th edition without trying too hard. They can also easily be ported into, say, Cypher system as they are, and just or there's also Cypher system rules for this sort of thing if you really want to just dive into that. But here, these are options for rules that are they're so simple, it wouldn't be too hard to tag them into almost anything. And I think that they would only enhance your game, especially a Gothic themed campaign, but any fantasy themed campaign where you want good and evil, or law and chaos, and the struggle between the two to be a tangible part of how your universe works. Corruption, dread, and curses will only add to the richness. Excuse me. They'll only add to the richness of your campaign world. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy your day. Peace be with you. Bye-bye.